I'm presenting a pre-analysis plan, so I'm really looking forward to your feedback. This is joint work with a longtime collaborator, Leo Boccini, also with Katja Kleinberg at Binghamton. And we're not registered yet. So to the extent that you've been kind of holding back in your criticisms in the interest of decorum or something, or the community standards, like, we should maintain those. But you can kind of take the gloves off to a certain degree here, because I really would like and value your recommendations on a variety of issues here, particularly related to the experiment. Okay, so we start with the premise that AI at scale is likely to present several challenges to capitalism. And given these challenges, we think that the sustainability of capitalism is really subject to the popular sort of legitimacy of the system. And therefore, we think it's a natural exercise to examine the potential impact of AI shocks on people's attitudes towards market institutions. So that's kind of where we're headed here. Now, there are a variety of ways that artificial intelligence could affect capitalist institutions. We're going to focus on two here. And abstract away from several others, including things like surveillance capitalism, which is a topic that we haven't really gotten into as much over the last couple of days, but I think is important, this notion of privacy and the degree to which artificial intelligence invade that and start to affect people's behavior in ways that they find unsatisfying. But we're going to focus really specifically on the market impact and abstract away from the kind of the potential non-market disruptions. And in particular, the number one, I think, focus of this conference so far has really been on this labor market impact. And while speculative, there's reason to believe that AI, particularly as it advances, is going to reduce the need for human workers. Okay. And a second mechanism through which artificial intelligence could impact capitalism is through competition itself. Which is something on which capitalism relies for the efficient allocation of resources, et cetera. And as artificial intelligence expands, and what we've seen so far in the digital economy is this tendency towards concentration and perhaps somewhat of a decline in competition as a result. So we're going to take a completely novel approach here, something we've never seen before, which is a priming experiment to explore the potential impact of these factors on people's attitudes towards market institutions. We're going to also have a second intervention where we look at how policy could potentially moderate these effects. And I want to just say here that, in the interest of time, I'm really going to focus on kind of the theoretical motivation for the first one, the labor impact, which is something that we've discussed in more detail here over the last couple of days. But we'll leave the concentration mechanisms, the theoretical logic behind that for the Q&A if you'd like. Tapping into a lot of literature, I think we are kind of the first to think about the direct impact of AI and technological shocks like AI on support for capitalism, but it's related to a lot of things that have been presented today. I think this is a real-time literature review, including many of the papers that were presented over the last couple of days. If your paper fits into one of these categories, you don't see it up there, it's because I did not have a chance to review it while making this slide, but please send me an email and I'll be sure to include it. One of the important, I think, contributions, kind of controversial, not everyone loves this book, but Johnson and Asimoglu's book on power and progress and looking historically at the impact of technology. And they're essentially making the argument that that technology doesn't necessarily lead to widespread improvements in the quality of life and economic outcomes, but instead it's really dependent on governments' responses to those technological changes. So I find some of those arguments rather compelling, and I think they inform kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. And then there's, of course, the literature on AI attitudes and concerns that we're tapping into, AI distributive consequences. We're going to spend less time on that. I think, as we've discussed over the last couple of days, some of this is really highly speculative. And so we're concerned really about personal economic anxiety, regardless of your industry or your potential, exposure to AI, but I'd be interested in your feedback on how we might press that further. And then popular demands for institutions in response to AI, which a lot of people have done great work on. And I think probably we're most related to the work on automation, even though it's more automation more generally and not necessarily AI, but the links between automation and people's support for free markets, and in particular, kind of support for free trade. I think we're really quite closely related to that work. So our approach here is informed by, I think one way to kind of illustrate the way we're thinking about this is kind of just a modified Cobb-Douglas production function. So I want to start by thinking about, okay, what's the potential impact at the macroeconomic level, and then we want to see how that might translate into individual attitudes. But if you think about a modified Cobb-Douglas production function, you have artificial intelligence that enters in with labor, and there's a parameter gamma that essentially represents the effectiveness of AI at doing human tasks. So as gamma increases, the contribution of labor to output declines, and so too does labor's share of income. And so that's essentially the logic that we're working with here. Now, it's important to note that as gamma increases, it's also likely to increase the productivity of existing labor that is maintained, which could lead to widening inequality as well, which is something that we think is worth exploring. So taking those kind of macroeconomic effects on the labor market and then thinking about what they might mean for individuals, is the next step in our theoretical logic here. And we think that, first of all, that the reduction in labor demand, even if you don't necessarily perceive that it's going to certainly affect you, there's a degree of uncertainty there that increases your economic anxiety. And so we're going to call that channel the economic insecurity channel. And then, there's a more philosophical idea here, which is that capitalism is essentially an implicit contract between capital and labor. And it works because labor exchanges their work for wages, which in turn then are increasing demand for new goods and services in a virtuous cycle. But if workers perceive that the system that's evolving as a result of artificial intelligence no longer ensures fair compensation for their work, they might see that as a breach of that implicit social contract, and therefore what we're going to call institutional kind of illegitimacy. So what we want to do then is explore the ways in which artificial intelligence can impact people's attitudes along these kind of two dimensions. And so what we're going to try to do is capture that in our dependent variables. And the hypothesis that we're going to explore here, and the one I'm going to focus on here today, is that AI-driven labor displacement increases economic insecurity and weakens that institutional legitimacy, which could then in turn undermine support for capitalism. And then the secondary hypothesis on top of this would be that there's the possibility that certain policy responses could moderate these effects. In terms of the design here, thinking about this in terms of a kind of a 3x3, where we're looking at two treatment vignettes, which represent those two channels, the labor market channel as well as the concentration channel, followed up by a secondary intervention, which are kind of policy vignettes representing compensation policy as well as a regulation policy dealing with the regulation of that concentration. And then in terms of the dependent variables here, we're thinking about attitudes towards capitalism, but one of the things we wanted to avoid doing was actually using the word capitalism, which has in it many, it's very difficult to know what people even think about when they hear that word. But we're very concerned that it has kind of loaded implications that we want to try to avoid. And what we instead want to do is tease out people's attitudes about economic insecurity, their tolerance for that economic insecurity that is inherent in the capitalist system, as well as their concerns about their contributions to the economy as workers. And then a control group will receive no information on those AI threats. So the flow chart looks like this. There's a set of pre-treatment questions, and then the first intervention is either on that labor market threat or the concentration threat or a control group that doesn't receive any information. And then the second intervention is on the compensation policy versus the regulatory policy versus a control group that gets no information. And then we ask the post-treatment survey questions on attitudes towards capitalism. Let me jump to those dependent variables because I want you to kind of think about these before I move into the interventions themselves. Again, trying to tease out our theoretically motivated kind of micro foundations here along two dimensions, which is one, your preferences, your ideas about economic uncertainty and insecurity, that kind of trade-off that's inherent in the capitalist system. There's going to be some degree of uncertainty and inequality, but there's also going to be opportunities to succeed. And so how willing or how happy are people about that dimension? We're going to ask questions like, what are your preferences for an economy that offers more freedom for individuals and business to succeed or fail, or one that limits risks? Perhaps more politically loaded given the debates around the presidential election and Kamala Harris's apparent controversy around this notion of equal opportunities versus equal outcomes. But we do think that people's attitudes along that trade-off are relevant here in exploring the economic uncertainty angle. And then secondly, on the legitimacy of the capitalist contract, we're interested in people's perceptions about the economy, whether or not it provides good job opportunities for those who want to work, fairly compensates workers for their labor, and then beliefs that over the next decade that's likely to continue, even though there's these AI implications for labor markets and for concentration. Okay, so our treatments, these are very much works in progress. We were first exploring a much longer treatment, and based on kind of what recent research is suggesting, along with a little pilot that we did where things appeared that we could not believe, including, by the way, and I want to flag this because there's a lot of people doing survey research. We had an enormous amount of speeders and folks who failed comprehension checks. So I don't know if this is an issue that you're all kind of seeing increasing over time, but it was a concern to us. So I'm not presenting the pilot results as a result because of the fact that we don't necessarily believe them. This was forthright. So on the labor threat, something very simple here is what we want to do is really drive home the point that, many jobs could be lost. I found in previous work that providing a picture is also quite useful. So looking at the kind of the share of jobs that might disappear over time could be one way to go about this. And on concentration, really highlighting this idea that we could end up with a few large companies that dominate their industries, making it difficult for competitors to succeed. And then on the secondary set of treatments, these are the ones that are more focused on policy. We are exploring the idea of compensation, which would directly address perhaps assuage their fears about the labor market implications and job losses, as well as a regulatory treatment that would address more explicitly the concentration threat here with AI. So again, looking forward to your feedback and suggestions on how we might do this more effectively, but that's kind of the idea that we have right now. So to sum up, I think AI at scale presents a number of challenges for capitalism, and we're just kind of beginning to explore what that might look like. And understanding people's attitudes about those challenges and the ways in which perhaps policy responses might ameliorate their fears is the exercise that we're interested in conducting. So thank you very much.
Should I go? In the interest of being a friendly critic, I'm going to push back very strongly. So for labor dislocation, why not offer the alternative scenario, which is consistent with economic history, which is that supply curves are shifted out, demand curves are shifted out, and the demand for labor over the long run is an upward sloping curve. If you keep shifting demand curves for labor out, over the long run, it actually slopes up. Acemoglu has shown this to be the case for the type of labor that's very skilled, and it might not be the case for labor that's unskilled. So we get into distribution, but as a macro phenomenon, which is consistent with the way that you've framed the paper, it's actually pretty symmetrical to say that, because you're not getting into distribution per se. So I actually don't think it would be out of bounds to paint that scenario in that way. Channeling Magistro et al., what about consumption? Like, labor is great, but labor is a means towards an end. And if you believe Gary Becker, it's a mean towards leisure and consumption, right? So who cares about labor? Again, we might fetishize labor or not, or maybe people think labor should be valorized or not. But if you believe Becker and a bunch of economists, nobody cares about labor. They care about the weekend. Labor gets them to the weekend, and then you have fun, right? And then on concentration, I would say, why do people care about the concentration of an industry? Like, think about digital devices. So smartphones, tablets, Alexa, and the remote control that powers my television. Like, I don't really care if there's one company, 12, or 3. I care about prices and innovation, right? And what I care about is within specific products, how concentrated the supply is, because that will really define prices and innovation, but not in industries. And again, I'm nitpicking, but maybe you could think of a different term. Not a bric-a-brac category like industry, but like for phones or for shoes or for Pringles. That's where concentration might matter. It's not clear. There could be a monopolist that actually strategically prices at marginal cost to shift demand curves out. Which goes back to my original point. But I just think being a bit more symmetric might be helpful, because I think you'll learn more about that. Okay.
Can I add a two-finger? Because, I mean, you probably can tell that Victor was my advisor, but I was going to make the same point, and I do think you could benefit a lot. I would be curious, actually, to see what happens to attitude store capitalism with the opposite type of scenario. I mean, nothing might happen, but that's I was going to say the same thing, so Bao.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond first, or? Go ahead, so my critique, or perhaps I guess you haven't done the study, and thank you everyone who's presented sort of pre-analysis plans, allowing us to give you feedback. So one thing that we have talked a lot about is SB 1047, and I want to bring it up again because I think one of the central debates is around the potential for concentration in the AI space, where a lot of smaller players, academics, open source AI developers are very scared that they cannot meet the legal compliance. But on the other side of the argument, some of these, there's a concern that proliferation of foundation models is a national security threat, as I previously mentioned. And there is a conflict between a few players having excessive power in this industry versus perhaps sort of public safety concerns, broadly defined. And then there's the question, if these companies are so powerful and say that they can develop AGI, there's some people who are calling for like nationalization of foundation AI developers. Yeah. I mean, it's a little fringe, but that seems to be very anti-capitalism. And I do think there is, people, certainly amongst maybe a segment of the population, they might care about market concentration as part of this like idea of we're going to eventually reach a point if OpenAI or whomever, DeepMind, is going to achieve AGI, it's going to cause like digital feudalism where, every profit generating thing has to go through this AGI. I mean, I personally don't think it's far fetched, but there is this fear of like digital feudalism that is being discussed among some circles.
If I could just, follow up on that, Balbo. So, what's the recommendation that's coming out of that? I agree with you that those conversations around, super doom are there. Is there a way that you're squaring that with attitudes towards capitalism and that we should think about? Is that your suggestion, or?
Yes, I think there are some super doom people who are anti-capitalism in that they think these companies are going to become even more powerful than the government, and therefore it's like not legitimate that they should have such power, and like the government should nationalize their labs. So like,
So you're suggesting then if we go in the corporate power angle and concentration, we might as well just make it a very strong treatment, suggesting that these types of outcomes are possible. Is that, I guess?
That could be like one very super intense treatment, but
Yeah.
also in terms of the outcome, like would you want to nationalize AI?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yep. Should I respond to that? Yeah. So points well taken. We've been in conversations over the last week on this exact issue, making it symmetric. I do admit that I have fallen a little bit into AI doom over the last couple of years, and I think it's really important to recognize that there are immense possibilities for increased productivity, efficiency, lower prices, leisure that could very well have an impact on people's attitudes towards capitalism. In fact, it might make them much more excited about the future. In some ways, I think that we academics are kind of the wrong people to be thinking about the good side of AI because we're so. Because we do enjoy our work so much. But I think that we are outliers. And the average person says, look, if I don't have to work so much, that sounds like a really great thing and a system that I could really get behind. I think, thank you very much. And you won't believe how we will take that suggestion and run with it. You too, Beatrice. Thank you.
I actually had a two finger on what Victor was saying because I was thinking exactly the same. And I was wondering if perhaps something that would be very interesting here would be to focus on compensation and legitimacy. And why I bring this up is because while we have a reinstatement effect that it has been shown like in the literature on economics of AI, it could be the case that this reinstatement effect is not necessarily reinstating the same people or into the same jobs. And so like maybe their economic insecurity is going up and they're expecting some sort of compensation from the government, but maybe they cannot address it. Or for example, they cannot be retrained. And for example, I have been doing some work with a Quatermain Q-only in which we have shown that, for example, when the compensation system starts failing for exogenous reasons, then people start believing less in the social contract, as you were saying. So I was just wondering if there could be a focus more on that, which is an angle that I actually haven't seen at all.
Yeah, I don't really want Daron Acemoglu as my referee, so I'm not relying too much on his model. No, I'm just kidding. I think, I know those models in economics that, there's the displacement effect being offset by a reinstatement effect. Okay, so what are the implications of that for workers? How do they think about their place in that? Will they be one of the people who are then using the technology to become more productive? Yeah, I think that's another way that this could definitely be taken. I think it's one that relies on assumptions about people's place in the distribution of skills and which of those workers are more likely to be reinstated versus displaced, and that's something that I think we're trying to avoid at this point. But yeah, that's a great point. I think the way people think about that could influence their attitudes on these dimensions. So thank you very much.
So, thanks for sharing this, Stephen. Maybe one friendly provocation and then one sort of small tactical suggestion, actually maybe two small ones. So one is, so I totally agree, we haven't seen much work on, support for capitalism. And I was kind of hoping that you would lean into that more. So I noticed that you didn't want to load people with, what this term means. Yeah. But I thought there might be good reasons to actually do that because we have a lot more work talking about support for particular regulation, protection, steering, whatnot,
Yeah.
but not how does this affect your feelings towards capitalism and socialism, authoritarianism, whatever. So that would be pretty unique, even if you put it at the bottom of your
Yeah.
outcome questions.
Okay.
So a very subtle tactical thought is maybe lowering the complexity of some of the language. I was wondering if audiences understood what market concentration and compensation mean.
Okay.
So this is maybe a good one for ChatGPT to just knock it down a few grade levels.
Okay.
And then last, there's a study out a couple years ago comparing different survey vendors. So you may be able to find one that has higher attention rates.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Any suggestions that you're aware of?
If I, Prolific's been pretty good. Lucid's reasonable.
YouGov's really good. YouGov's great. They're expensive.
Okay. YouGov, yeah. Great.
Give some suggestions, because my co-authors and I have been talking about it. So we CAPTCHA to prevent the bots. I think a lot of it is bots. Adding when they open questions, see if the answers are weird or answer too quickly.
Yeah.
They're almost always weird these days.
Repeat the question.
It's troubling.
Like you can answer inconsistently. Like if it's like, how old are you? And they give two different answers. It could be a bot. Hidden questions that human respondents are not going to see. Like maybe make the text like invisible or something, but the bots will try to answer it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, Tina.
Surely, so that we keep getting back to this. Oh, is this too optimistic or too pessimistic in this case? And then you need to adjust and so on. But like that's part of how people think about this, and I think it's a legitimate question what you are posing. But even if it's true, some of these, in the long term, people adjust and labor demand of labor increases and whatever, it can still be true that people don't feel they can suddenly retrain every 3 years to completely new jobs, or that there's a basic need for safety and some predictability, and that people are okay with a lot of disruption and capitalistic, but up to a point where it's too much. And then it's okay, yes, but maybe at a slower pace. No? So I think like these questions, it's not about its doom or pessimism, but that they are legitimate questions, what you are asking.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's that uncertainty, right? Things could go well, they could go poorly, but as you increase uncertainty, that's going to then lead to questions about the system more generally, absent some sort of a perhaps enhanced safety net or what have you. Is that kind of where you? Yeah. No, that's like cool. So if we do happen to go in this direction of more symmetric sort of positive versus negative effects, I think that it would suggest then that the secondary interventions on policy could then also move in that direction. One approach would be to say a government approach would be to regulate more to stifle the use of these technologies, and the other one would be just the opposite, which would be the government should be providing the incentives so that these technologies are more widely used and more widely available. Does that sound right? Full symmetry on both interventions, yeah, okay.
Any questions for the two speakers together? Carlos, do you want to come up and then we'll turn it over to Peter to close us out? I mean, in some sense, you're both projecting into the distant future, and Steve, you started kind of with talking about, the end of capitalism, whereas Catalyst was saying, democracy in the long run is going to be fine. Catalyst, does your model change under Stephen's long-term assumptions, potential assumptions, sort of the bleak future of a highly concentrated, market with very little return to labor itself? Does that complicate kind of the long-term scenario for democracy? And I guess on the flip side, let's say Catalyst is wrong, and democracy does collapse in some number of countries. How do we think about capitalist markets under that scenario and kind of mitigation of AI risks as well?
I don't know. I cannot answer about the future, and
Fiction at this point.
I always tell my students that if I did, I would be immensely rich. So I'm not. Means I cannot. I mean, the only thing is that we feed the data, or we have a theory, and we feed the data into this theory, and you can say that if the rate of change is such that it's very fast and it reduces the jobs to very few people that continue to be complementary to capital, this may have an effect on distribution of such a kind that they will basically flip the results, and no matter how much income you have, you cannot compensate unless you socialize, perhaps in some way, this wealth, perhaps through pension plans or something, since a lot of them are, the investors of these, right? I have a sort of, question more for the audience, which is, coming from outside, that in all these surveys that I have seen, that have been, or most of them, there are exceptions, but the treatments and the information that is given is very generic. And so it's very short, right? So people are said, it looks like something is going to happen, right? How do you feel about it? And I wonder whether there is not a way to think about these, so to make these treatments have more biting power. And, that would imply introducing some sort of, numbers in a scenarios about income shocks, right? So, it would mean not about me working more or less, but, my wage is going down or up or whatever. That would also, to complicate things, it would not just be about the income of the respondent, but of course the relative income. So, because a lot of people, or perhaps, we are not sure, but we can perhaps posit that some people do not just care about their income, but their position with respect to others, right? And this is something that I have not seen in these surveys, again, with exceptions. I mean, the Beatrice et al. Paper has numbers. So, I think it would be, this way one could integrate these more into these more macro models where you scale up responses and you see how the political system operates, right? The second thing is that it would be interesting to have more trade-offs. So to, tell people that the government is going to compensate and be fair to everyone, that's not how politics works. Yes, it does, but, at some point you have some sort of budget constraint and it kicks in. And I wonder, is it possible, right? So with these things, I think that it would, sort of push these things forward. And again, this would allow then to link it to more macro level models, because sometimes I'm not exactly sure how to, take all these results and move them to the voting and to the aggregation of preferences and so on and so forth, right?
I don't have a lot to add at this point. Are there other questions we want to take? Yeah.
Can I add a quick two-finger to what Steve was saying? I don't think necessarily that if you add the symmetry thing, that means that people who see the optimistic scenario do not want any sort of government intervention, right? Because the fact that the net effect is going to be positive doesn't mean that there aren't going to be winners and losers. But then I think, for instance, what economists recommend is redistribution rather than protectionism. So then you could see if, the positive scenario leads to more efficient solutions instead of more inefficient solutions. So that was just a quick thought. But I know Steve.
Sure. This is a small one from back in the queue for Steve, but from Gone for Good, we know that, or we have good suspicion that kind of the source of layoffs doesn't always matter, that there are knock-on effects regardless of their origin story. Yeah. So in your experiment, do you want an unattributed source of labor anxiety or an unattributed source of market concentration?
Right. That's great. Yeah. So I think it's a bigger question that I think relates to a lot of the work that has been presented over the last couple of days. It's like, what is unique about AI? And I think most of our answers here revolve around this idea that this is that is likely to be, the experts suggest that it's likely a very transformational change. It's unlike other technological shocks in the past in its ability to displace workers, because once you get towards systems that can complete multiple tasks, then you're able to then replace full jobs, right? And so I think I think we have to tee off of that rather than just say, rather than just priming on economic anxiety more generally. So I think, but I think the burden is on all of us, through this process of doing this research to really understand what makes the artificial intelligence shock different. And why people might respond to it differently than to other shocks. And so I'm sort of leaning into the camp of making it specific around AI. But it makes me nervous on the other hand, right? Because we are dealing in the realm of speculation. These job losses have not occurred yet. And it requires, I think, some theorizing about how people are likely to interpret these things that are more speculative at this point.
Great takeaways from both of you. Thanks both of you for the last panel. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Lowen to close us out.